Hello, lovely people of the internet. I'm Red, aka Savage Minnow. You can refer to me by whatever pronouns you feel most comfortable using. I did the voiceover for this video last night, and as I was doing what I thought was kind of the final touches on the editing today, I realized I don't have an intro, so I guess this isn't going out until tomorrow. Sorry for the people who I told you it would be going out today. This also isn't like any of my other videos, so I'm not really sure how to introduce it. In the voiceover portion, which is going to be the rest of this video after the introduction, I'm going to be showing some time-lapse footage of a drawing challenge that I gave myself to draw 100 roses. Please don't give me too much shit in the comments. I know that I'm really bad at drawing roses. That's part of the reason why I gave myself the challenge specifically to draw the roses. They don't get a whole lot better by the end of the video. I realized in editing, like, they do actually get better, but a good portion of my improvement was in speed, and when I edit them all together to be a time lapse where they all take the same amount of time, it's not really apparent. So please just don't be mean. Okay, thank you. This video is mostly for the people who have been asking, but if you just stumbled across this, I guess I will give you a little bit of context in the description. I noticed in editing that I mentioned a lot of topics that I could do another video on, and I'm certainly not opposed to doing those videos on those topics, particularly if it's something that people will find helpful, like identifying red flags or even just relating to going through emotional trauma. But I just want to say that this video did take a lot out of me. It didn't even end up covering all the things that I thought that the short and condensed version would. So just bear with me and know that it just took a lot out of me. And if you guys want those videos, I'm fine with doing them. They just might take me a while. To quote Dr. Viktor Frankl, as he quoted Lessing, "There are things which must cause you to lose your reason, or you have none to lose. An abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior." And without further ado, cue the time lapse. Okay, so I promised y'all like over a year and a half ago that I would give you a video about the situation with my mom, and yeah, I'm hoping that this is going to be that video, or at least enough of an overview that I can direct people here as a starting point. I've lost track of how many attempts I've made at making this video. There's just too much information for one video. I can't really organize all my thoughts around it. So this is going to skip over a lot. Let me know if there's anything that you need me to elaborate on in the comments, or if something was confusing without context. I'm doing this as a voiceover because it's just kind of hard to talk about, and I feel like if I do it on camera, there's just going to be so many cuts that it's going to be distracting. So on screen, I'm just going to put time-lapse footage of a drawing challenge that I gave myself to draw 100 roses. I promise the roses do get better by the end, but it's just something to stare at if you want to. Also, great big warning for those of you who might have younger ears listening in. I won't be going into detail at all, but I will be discussing some massively dysfunctional family issues and adult themes. If you don't want to have an extremely uncomfortable conversation with your kid right now, I suggest making sure that they're out of earshot before you get too far into this video. So for the sake of brevity, I'm going to speed past all the history with my mom, and I'm just going to say that we were very close. She has now been married for over 40 years to my dad, who has MS and is in a care home, but at the time of all of this, he was living with my mom. I had previously lived with him in their basement in kind of a mother-in-law apartment for a few years when I first moved back to town to help my mom take care of my dad, but during the pandemic, it got really hostile in the house. It was really not a great living situation with all of us together, so I ended up buying a house that was less than a mile away from my mom so that I could be close and be available when they needed help, but I could also get away from the dynamic in the house. While I was living with my parents, actually right after I first moved back in with them, is when I met my ex at a sci-fi convention. I don't want to say the name of the convention in this video because I don't have time to get into all the nuance of the situation, but I will just say that the convention organizers were super professional, and none of this should reflect on them poorly at all. They were all really awesome. So really quick, I'm going to pop up a picture or two of me and my ex. You might notice a couple of things. If you aren't looking at the screen, no worries. I will let you know that he is much older than me. I'm not going to shit on age gap relationships in this video, but there is an additional dynamic to our relationship that is particularly problematic, and some of you may have spotted it. I'm not going to say my ex's full name in this video, but if you're also a sci-fi fan and happen to be watching the screen, his face might look a little bit familiar to you, and that's because he's an actor who has appeared in a handful of beloved sci-fi franchises. If you're not looking at the screen, it's really not important beyond that. I've thought about it enough, and I feel comfortable putting his picture in here because I feel like it gives context and validity to the discussion, but I don't think I'm going to put it in the thumbnail. It's not really that important. Again, I'm not going to say his full name, but he's an actor, and he was more than twice my age at the time. I think I was 29 and he was 63 when we first got together, and that's not a problem on its own, but it did lend itself to a potential imbalance of power, which is exactly what happened in our situation. Again, I'm trying to make this video as short as possible, so I won't go into the minutiae of the relationship, but I will say that it became very toxic. There were a lot of times when I felt pressured into situations that I wasn't really comfortable with, and I felt like I had to show that I was worthy of him or something. It was kind of a mind trip. I don't know. One of the things I really regret is this was back when my Nana was alive and she was paying for my tuition, and I dropped out of college when I was with him because he wanted me to travel with him, and yeah. I regret that so much I can't even say. That's actually one of the biggest regrets of my life. There was also a general lack of respect coming from him in our relationship, and like I said, I'm not going to get into all of it, but I do think that I should kind of explain that things ended because of a lack of respect. At one point, this was the time when the term non-binary was first kind of coming into popularity, and I'm not sure if I'd come out to him as genderqueer at that point. It's not really a thing that I ever hid, but back then it was not something that people really talked about. And then when I tried to explain to him that the term non-binary meant people like me, his response was, "Don't tell me that. That's gross." Again, I might go into details in another video just about all the red flags that I missed and stuff like that, but the final straw for me was that it became starkly apparent that he didn't respect same-sex relationships for bisexual and pansexual people as holding the same weight as relationships where those people would be perceived as quote-unquote straight. Basically, it became apparent to me that he objectified my past relationships with women as part of his sexual fantasies, which was really gross to me. And at that point, I stopped putting myself through all the things that I felt like I needed to do in order to be worthy of being his girlfriend. And he didn't really like that, and things started to spiral. And one night I told my now best friend that the next day I was going to break up with him. And when I talked to him on the phone the next day, he actually suggested that we end things before I could say it. So I figured that was a really good way to break up, right? That we could both move forward knowing that we ourselves had decided to end things. And certainly since I was dealing with a man in his 60s, we weren't going to have to be dealing with high school drama bullshit, right? Well, no, actually, I was very wrong. At that point, I decided to go to nail school, and the first month that I was there was such hell because he would call me and text me all kinds of abuse while I was in class. And I actually ended up having to shut off my phone during class and not just leave it in my car because it would forward all of my messages to my tablet, even if it wasn't connected to Wi-Fi. I had teachers send me home because it was causing a disruption, and I actually ended up graduating late because I had to make up so many days. But I do have my nail license, so there's that. So I got my license in 2019. Just a reminder, I was living with my parents at this time, and as my ex was much older than I am, it didn't really strike me as all that odd that my mom got to be friends with him while he and I were dating. But it was a little irritating during our breakup when he kept calling her and texting her to complain about me. It was really bad for my mental health, and looking back, I realized that it was sort of the first rock falling in what ended up being an avalanche of depression and really bad mental health. I'm not even going to get into all of that in this video because we're already how far in and we haven't even gotten to the year this happened. But in 2021, that's when my Nana died in August. Some of you probably remember this from when we had to cancel a stream and reschedule a few times because of the funeral, etc. She didn't die from COVID, but she probably would have gotten better medical care and maybe lived if there wasn't COVID, but there were also a lot of other factors. She was kind of the matriarch of the family, and that was really hard, and there were some financial things that came up that I'm not really going to go into, but just know that it was really hard for all of us when we lost my Nana. Not just me, not just my mom, all of us, really. And this is speculation on my part, but it seemed like some of the members of the family just sort of stopped trying to do things for the sake of the whole family and just focused on themselves. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. It's just kind of a thing that I noticed that happened at that time. And I really tried to be there for my mom because I knew that this was probably hitting her harder than it was hitting me. And I was trying to be the person to help her do all the things that she had to do. She was the only daughter. She's also the one who lived closest to my Nana. My mom's house is on the same estate as my Nana. And it was just really hard for me as well. Basically, my entire life, my plan was for me to move onto that estate when I was older. But due to the financial situation, that wasn't really an option, and we had to sell my Nana's house. But I shoved that shit down and tried to be the best support that I could. At that time, I knew that my mom was still in contact with this guy that was my ex. In fact, she even mentioned him a couple of times on stream, I think. And again, I knew that my mom needed support even before my Nana died, just like emotional support. So as much as it made me feel really weird that she still talked to him, again, I just shoved that shit down because my mom needed support. It was really toxic living in that house with my dad. And as many times as I tried to suggest to her that she put him in a care home, she really heard none of it. So it made sense to me that she would be leaning on friends to help keep her sane. At least that's what I thought. Every once in a while, my mom would tell me about some comment that my ex would make about some update in my life, like when I got engaged to Cora and when we bought the house and moved. And I remember at one point getting a little bit snippy with her, being like, why are you even giving him information about my life? And she was like, well, he's my friend and it's also about my life. And I was like, yeah, okay, I guess that makes sense. And again, I just shoved that shit down because I really didn't think I had any other option. Also, a little side note here for context, many years ago, my brother dated a woman who was here on a student visa, and after they broke up, my mom stayed in contact with her and sort of took her on under her wing as family. So it wasn't really unheard of for my mom to stay in contact with one of her children's exes, and she would bring this woman up anytime that I hinted at being uncomfortable with her staying in contact with Eric. It felt sort of like I was being told, well, your brother is fine with me being in contact with his ex, so if you have a problem with me being in contact with your ex, that's because you're the problem. It wasn't ever stated outright, but that was sort of hinted. It's interesting looking back on that now and realizing that the timing coincides with when my brother started dealing with some serious mental health issues and physically separated himself from the rest of the family by many, many miles. I can't say that those two things have any correlation, but it does make me wonder in retrospect. So fast forward a few months and I've been dealing with a lot. I'm not sure if I had made it public at that point or not, but Cora and I were splitting up at that point. But again, no time for all of that in this video, but just know I was not doing well. But at that time, really no one was doing well, so I was kind of just like holding it together while everyone else had their turn to fall apart, I guess is the best way that I can put it. So January 13th, 2022, my mom asked if she could come over for a bit. I just assumed that she needed to get out of the house with my dad. So I said, sure, come on over. And when she got there, she told me that she needed to tell me something. And then she proceeded to break down in tears and tell me that she and my ex have developed romantic feelings for each other, and tried to explain these feelings and ask for my blessing, basically. A weird thing happened to me while this was going on, and I now know from therapy that this is called dissociation, but it's not the same for everyone. I don't think I can really fully explain it to anyone who hasn't experienced it, but it was like I identified that the things that I was hearing were really disquieting, and I could recognize that it was causing a lot of distressing feelings. But here was my mother sitting in front of me actively in the throes of distress. And I was like, I could see all of these feelings that were coming at me like a tsunami wave about to crash. And I don't know how to explain it, but it was sort of like I reached into my internal control panel and just disconnected my feelings. I stayed completely calm that night and I didn't raise my voice at all. I just told my mom that I really couldn't get my head around it. Like, it does not compute. I told her that I was sorry because I wanted her to be happy, but it was not something I could accept, and that even if I tried to frame it in my mind as just a friend who caught feelings for my ex, I wouldn't be able to continue that friendship, much less if they stayed in contact with him. I was completely calm during the conversation, and when she hugged me goodbye over 3 hours after she had arrived, she told me that she would contact him and end things with him that very night, and I remember apologizing for not being able to be okay with it, which is kind of weird now that I think about it. To be clear, I do wish that I could somehow be okay with it. Like, I really wish that I could be unbothered and just accept it. But the fact that that very night I immediately jumped to "I'm sorry" rather than being offended at the suggestion that I somehow accept my mother and my ex pursuing a relationship is just, well, it's kind of weird. Contacted a friend immediately after that, and they got on Discord with me and listened to me try to wrap my head around it while we did some gaming. And I remember feeling like I should be disgusted and angry and disrespected and hurt and all of these things. And then realizing that I did have all of those feelings, but I wasn't actually feeling them, if that makes sense. Like that switch on the control panel was stuck or something. It was kind of like I was in a big stadium up in the nosebleeds and I could see my feelings down on the field, and there was something like a scoreboard or a jumbotron that could show me what was going on, but I couldn't really directly interact with them. That feeling, or lack of feeling really, persisted for over a month of just exactly like that, where I just didn't feel anything really. And I remember at one point realizing that I was not emotionally present while I was going through my Nana's things with my mom, and realizing that I was missing the only opportunity that I was going to have to emotionally engage with a lot of these items. And spending the last hours in her house and realizing how frustrating it was, but also, and this is the weird part that I can't stress enough, I couldn't even fully connect with that frustration I was feeling enough to voice it or act on it at all. I don't really have any solid memories of that whole month. Like, all I have are just sort of glimpses and feelings, like what you remember of a dream when you first wake up before you start trying to remember, and it all fades away. And as that month was progressing, it became more and more apparent to me that not only had my mother not cut contact with my ex that night, but she also really wanted to stay in contact with him. Things kind of came to a head for me in February after she gave me a ride to get a large item from the store in her van, and on the way back, while I felt like I was being held captive in the vehicle with her, she asked me once again to reconsider my aversion to the two of them pursuing a romantic relationship. And I remember having this sort of thought that this is my mom and she's my best friend, and surely if I could explain to her what I'm feeling, that she would understand and stop drawing this out so that we could move on and go back to being besties. Because I would have dropped any other best friend permanently after a betrayal like that, but this was my mom. So I tried to tell my mom how I was feeling, almost like I was reading off of that scoreboard or explaining what was on the jumbotron, but she didn't seem to be getting the message and started to come back with how it's more age appropriate for him to date her rather than me, as if that was ever a factor, and how she's never asked me to cut ties with a friend for her sake, as if he's just some guy from the library, and I can't remember what else, but I just remember being like, how are you not seeing how distressing this is for me? And I remember running into my house and just collapsing on the floor as a wave of emotions just erupted, and just absolutely losing my shit and sobbing and hyperventilating until I threw up, and yeah, just losing my shit in general. It was sort of like there was no in between reading off the scoreboard and being on the field in the middle of a full contact sport. It's hard to explain. I really hope no one is taking shots for every time that I say that, because I'm sure that it is a lot of times. I have not counted. I feel like I've said it a lot. I'm sorry. But do you remember how I said that it was like I flipped a switch in my control panel that turned off my emotions? It was like if you've ever gone on vacation where there's no internet, or like lost your phone for a few days after it died, when you finally have it connected and you just get that onslaught of messages all at once and it's really overwhelming. Like, that's how it was whenever I was able to feel anything and sort of unstick that switch in my control panel. It was just like all at once, every feeling overwhelming. And I don't remember a whole lot from the next few weeks, but I remember calling up my mother and just like absolutely losing my shit with her on the phone. Before I go on, I want to be clear that my actions were not acceptable, and I'm not advocating for anyone to accept that type of behavior. No one deserves to be screamed at and called names over the phone. Yes, I was in a mental health crisis, but my mental health is my responsibility, not an excuse to abuse people. At that time, I was newly diagnosed with autism, and I didn't recognize what I was experiencing as an autistic meltdown at the time. But in retrospect, it was kind of like every single meltdown that I've ever had multiplied exponentially. It's a weird sort of emotional trauma that you experience when you feel betrayed by your security person. It's hard to explain, but again, I'll try. Anytime I feel any type of distress still in December of 2023, as of recording, it makes me long for my mother deeply. To be close to her, to be comforted by her. And actually that can be triggered by other emotions too. Distress is the one that will do it like real quick, but even if I'm happy about something and I like, if I just want to like share it with her, it's that feeling of longing, and then that energy runs full force into that feeling of betrayal, and it just reverberates and causes more distress and activates like this feedback loop that I just have to shut down to get out of it. Hence the roses, which are a challenge that I gave myself and also intended to be something to work on basically when my brain starts spiraling. Speaking of the roses, I was thinking that I should have enough footage that I can play it for about 40 minutes. I'm going to try and wrap this up really quick so I don't have to slow down to the video to where it's boring. So basically the next few weeks were like meltdowns constantly on the daily. Whenever I would feel any type of feelings, I would lose my shit. And I just remember being so hurt and lost and absolutely crushed from the inside. Again, I was being very abusive towards my mother at this time. I didn't really have any coping mechanisms apart from self-harm, and I was taking all of my anger and frustration out on my mother via screaming and shouting and just generally losing my shit, which is not a good way of coping. And at that time, I became very angry at myself, and I will not go into details about my self-harm because I know that's very triggering for a lot of people. But I just felt like if I was better, if I could just get over it, then I could go back to being friends with my mom. And a part of me still feels like that. And that's something that I'm dealing with in therapy. But it has been over a month now since I had a self-harm incident. So there's that. I won't go into specifics about therapy, but I did start seeing a new therapist online who is still my therapist and helped me a lot in those first weeks and months. And I can honestly say he saved my life. I remember getting to a point where it wasn't like all day anymore, and I could sort of start to do some basic functions like feeding myself and doing laundry without breaking down. And it was just this dull ache inside the pit of my stomach that I carried around with me. And then in May, a little over a month after I had started seeing my new therapist, I saw on my Amazon account that my mom used at the time that there was an order for 2 books to be shipped to none other than my ex. So that whole wave of emotions came crashing back and washed away all the hope that I had of her understanding how much pain I was in and choosing me over him, and that sent me into an entirely new spiral that was much deeper and lasted much longer. And maybe sometime I'll have time to go into it more, but I have this theory that because such a core part of my identity was built on the relationship that I had with my mother, that when that first part of that was taken out by the information that they had caught feelings for each other, yeah, that was a trauma. But I was able to lean on the parts of our relationship that I felt like were still intact. But then when it seemed to become apparent to me that she didn't see how I was hurting in February, it just revealed how unstable that portion of that was still intact was. And when I saw that order in May, it was like another wave of betrayal that just washed away those last little bits of hope in that relationship that I had been clinging on to with all of my strength. And that relationship was such a core part of my identity that my entire sense of self was destroyed. And I know that sounds a bit overdramatic, but I really think that it's true. If you want me to explain more, let me know in the comments. I'm going to cut this here because if I try to add more to this, it's never going to get posted. There's still a lot that I'd like to say, but I think I'm just going to post this before I lose track and set it aside again. A quick little update. I left my mom a note on Thanksgiving and she responded via email the day before I am recording this. Her response seems to indicate that she did cease contact with Eric for a short period of time last year before she ordered him books from my Amazon account, but because I was unable to heal enough to improve our relationship within that time frame, she had reached back out to reestablish contact with him and has continued to stay in contact with him since. The way that she worded it seems to indicate that she thought that somehow makes it better instead of worse. As I said, I received the email just yesterday, so I haven't had time to fully wrap my head around it. There were some logical inconsistencies that prompted me to request a mediator for further contact, and I'm hoping that she will take me up on that. Mama, if you're watching this, I love you and I miss you so much every day, and it hurts me so much, but I can't force you to choose me over him. I know I haven't always been the easiest person to have a relationship with, and I can't promise all sunshine and flowers, but I do promise to try if you'd let me. I can't promise you a time frame. I just know that the longer you stay in contact with him, the deeper it cuts and the harder it is to take, and the longer it will take me to heal. I'm sorry. To all the Cine Minis who are still listening, thanks. You're a real one. Thanks for sticking with me while I'm trying to heal. Love y'all. I'll catch and release you on the next one, all right? Go and send my little fry. Go and send.